I want to talk to you tonight about planting. Not something we see a lot of in Louisiana. And specifically in terms of the campus, about three things. One is about the relationship between buildings and planning, between architecture and architectural experiences and the overall master plan. Thank you, Chris.
No, hold on a second.
And two, about the thoughtful use of historical precedent, not to be restricted to that, but to be able to use it creatively. And three, about symbolism and representation of the values that we hold dear as a people and as a society, and how we see this on our campus. And I want to use the campus to do this. There aren't a lot of places in Louisiana where you can tell this story, and there could be more. And that's part of our job, I think, is to have this kind of expectations of our campus. The architect we'll talk about tonight, Theodore Lake, German, had the intention from the first that LSU would be a teaching campus, that it would be an embodiment of the Western classical traditions, and that students would come here from the rural highways of Louisiana, and after 4 years, take back with them a set of aspirations and expectations about what their lives could be like. So the campus, as you know, has grown well beyond its original scope. The dark green area here is the National Historic Register district. And I think there are 50 some odd buildings that are listed on the district. The ones in red here are the original core buildings designed by Theodore Lake that I'll focus on tonight. The story is a broad one. LSU, as you may know, was begun as an agricultural mechanical college just before the Second World War, Pineville, Second World War, the Civil War. We're going to stop before the Second World War. It operated very briefly. It was closed during the war, and after the war was moved to Baton Rouge. Existed for a while in the old, they used to call it the Deaf and Dumb Asylum on South Boulevard downtown. It's long since been gone. Kind of a Gothic revival building in a way. This is a picture of the Pineville original building, the only rendering that we have. And then it moved downtown where the state capitol complex is today, and was there for decades and decades and decades. And it finally was getting constrained in its downtown site, and began again in the teens to think about a new location, and secured options on a piece of property to the south of town. That's the old Capitol site there. Secured options on a piece of property south of town, and invited Rick Olmsted down to help convince the governor and the various committees in the legislature that moving would be a good idea. Some of you may be familiar with the great American landscape architect Frederick Law Olmsted, who has been an enormous influence on American culture, but actually had a relatively short practicing career. His son, Rick, and nephew, John, I think it was, carried on the firm. It carried on into the 1960s. Enormous amount of work. Rick Olmsted is responsible for the look of the National Mall, for example, in Washington, D.C. today. Very influential. He had been involved with what is now Audubon Park in New Orleans, the Cotton Centennial in the 1880s, and had made friends in the area, and so was asked to come down. And he a very thoughtful fellow, he advised the planning committee that they had two choices. One was to do what Harvard was doing, to stay on its old historic site as the city grew up around it, and to expand only by having to purchase properties at increasing cost and shoehorn itself into a local growing urban environment. The other was to do what Columbia had just done. Columbia had moved from where Rockefeller Center is today up to its site at 120th then, and at that point that was miles out the country. Nobody expected New York to grow that far. And that way they started over, but with a large site that had agricultural potential. And Olmsted advised the campus planners that that would be a good thing to do. And one of the ideas there, one of his points of logic, had to do with the agricultural mission of the campus. And the fact that Louisiana farmland was high ground in the north of the state and low ground in the south of the state, the floodplain and the hill country. And that both of those were available on this large site here. And so it's a site that suited, if you will, the agricultural mission. And a lot of the purpose of these agricultural colleges across the country really were to introduce scientific agriculture to the population, to the farmers, to slowly increase productivity and that sort of thing. That certainly was part of the message here. Now, one thing about this site that's so remarkable is this is a USGS survey map from 1910, somewhere thereabouts. And I've highlighted the high ground and the low ground and the Highland Road bluff. Well, what that bluff is the furthest east that the Mississippi River has been able to cut into the continental landmass as it moves around South Louisiana. And so it's a real significant location in that regard. And Baton Rouge just happens to lie along about a 10-mile, almost due north-south stretch of the river. And has a rich history amongst the native peoples that some of you are familiar with, I'm sure. One of the things about this particular site, this is the joys of PowerPoint Keynote, that we have to go back through these things, but one of the joys about this particular site, it was cleared and used as agricultural land. I'll show you a photo of it, but it had the two Indian mounds. Highland Road, what we know today as Highland Road, was a gravel road at the time. It was well outside of town. Once the property was secured, as College Town started to grow, right, then it became a viable real estate investment, and the Garden District, same kind of thing. They're both related to the fact that LSU moved out here. Here's what it looks like today, and this is a photo that Olmsted took of the parade ground today. Farming area. I don't know when it was cleared. I should mention that Professor Paul Hoffman is with us tonight, sitting right here in front. I'm sure he's going to keep track of all the mistakes I made. Most of the story I'm going to tell you tonight comes from Paul. His history of LSU, Volume 1, he told me earlier, his LSU Press has told him it's done. I don't know how long it'll be before it's available, but magnificent work. So the mounds here. I don't know what you know about these mounds. When I was working on the book, and there are a lot of people that helped with this effort, they had been carbon dated to 5,400 years old. That means that they are amongst the oldest man-made structures in the Western Hemisphere. Right? There is nothing older that we know of made by man. Now, somebody's told me that here recently they've redone that and they date them to 9,000 years old. And that's back even before our imagination of what history started here. We know obviously that there were people here, but we really don't know much about them. They don't have burial materials in them. They're too small to have been built on like some of the larger mounds further up the Mississippi. The only thing we know about them is where they are. And the place that they are is the last place that you can stand on high ground and see the Mississippi River. Now, I don't know that meant anything 9,000 years ago, but I'll take it as significant today. An interesting marker of the significance of this river in the history of civilization in this country. Olmsted was eventually hired once the decision was made to purchase the land and move the university down here. Olmsted was hired by the graces of a banker, New Orleans banker, who agreed to pay his initial fee to do a preliminary master plan. The first thing he did was have a detailed survey done of the entire site, every tree, every topo line, so that he knew the terrain very well. Around, the site was largely cleared, but around the mounds, there was a grove of trees, particularly old magnolia trees. I think some of them are still intact there, that he was particularly impressed with, these historic magnolia trees, and wanted to save. And he had a great sensitivity towards these mounds and their location at the bluff. He doesn't write about them. And in fact, much of the story that I'm going to talk about tonight does not come literally from Link or Olmsted. Some pieces do, but a lot of it is us scratching our heads and looking for potential meanings. These are some of Olmsted's photos of those Indian mounds, and then today as they stand. The first plan that Rick Olmsted did was based entirely on the topography and those mounds. Now, Chris, this is pointer here? Yeah, okay. So the mounds sit up here, Highland Road along here, and you see this original kind of quadrangle. The parade ground would be recognizable. It's in roughly the same place as the one we have now. Kind of an axis that goes out towards the sun, facing west, setting sun, with an opening at the bluff there. In fact, the first plans had no building here. Eventually a library goes in there. The placement of the library has been a problem here for a while. So a main quadrangle, fine arts, law, English, that sort of thing, sociology, that sort of thing as it existed. And then another quadrangle along the bluff for engineering, science, agriculture. And then up here where it was a little more treed, a men's dormitory quadrangle, the women over here eventually. And the culmination, all of these come together in a gathering spot that includes these Indian mounds and looks westward towards the river over the bluff. It's really a delightful planning idea, in my view. Closely following the landscape, organized about this kind of westward axis, symbolism there of some kind or another that involves the rotation of the sun, it involves time with these Indian mounds, and it involves the river, certainly. That's as much as I'm willing to speculate. Maybe you can help me figure out other grounds of significance there as we go through. So there's the original quad, this engineering science quad, men's dormitory quad, and then eventually women's dormitory quad. And some renderings of that, the bluff being here. Let me go back. The bluff being here, and this is a rendering done before they put a library there. So you see kind of a gateway, parade ground, what became Highland, this kind of ceremonial march that opens out onto the river into the floodplain down there. Before anybody thought about putting a football stadium in the floodplain. They were asked repeatedly by letter what the campus would look like when they did the plan, and they replied that, well, they were landscape architects. The architect would be hired to do the specific architecture, and so they didn't want to get too far down that road. They would think, and this was 1919, thereabouts, they would think that the historical roots of Louisiana culture, the French or perhaps the Spanish was important to them as an aspect of Louisiana history, or maybe English. Those were common in campus design. This was before European modernism took root in the United States. But in the archives, There's Rick. In the archives, we came across a series of drawings that apparently had never been shown to anybody here that depicted a kind of a Spanish, almost Mexican campus. Most of us think of our roots here as maybe French, and the Spanish had a big role here, but for the Olmsteds, it was an important dimension. Beautiful drawings. There's the kind of general campus plan in Olmsted's father, Frederick Law Olmsted. So a real simple kind of organization, this major axis that's key to the topography, the bluff forming the inspiration for these different quads, one of which with the mounds and the tree grove, and then a kind of a secondary, a student union and down to a gym armory and the parade ground would be here in that plan. Now, one of the things I admire so much about Frederick Law Olmsted, I think, is expressed in this quote from his son about the value of what we do to the earth. Protect and perpetuate whatever of beauty and inspirational value inherent in that landscape is due to nature and the circumstances not of one's own contriving. And to humbly subordinate to that purpose any impulse to exercise upon it one's own skill as a creative designer. It's an interesting kind of idea. Well, that's not exactly what happened. The Olmsted brothers submitted their plan, which was not very detailed. It was meant to be a preliminary master plan. And then submitted a proposal to go ahead and do the full development of the plan. When the state found out they were going to have to pay them for that, so that didn't work. And so they set about hiring an architect. There was tremendous pressure from a few New Orleans firms for this commission. And then there's the story of Theodore Link. Link shows up at this time. He was German, trained in Heidelberg as an engineer, had worked in New Mexico first for a while, wound up running the park system in St. Louis for a bit, and then put out his shingle as an architect. This is before licensing existed, or really before there was much architectural education, institutionalized architectural education in the United States. And he did a range of buildings in St. Louis, the Union Station there, if you know that, probably his most famous. He had he was asked to design a renovation of the Mississippi Capitol, the old Mississippi Capitol in Jackson. And then a few years later was asked back to design the new Capitol in Jackson, which he did. And then somewhere along the way, he got a commission to act as kind of a clerk of the works for the development of a higher education system in Mississippi. And so he did designs and financial and planning work all over the state. This was just next door to us. We don't know exactly how he got involved here. The job was advertised, and lots of connections possible. But he shows up here, and he's a very impressive fellow. He's got a great range of experience. He's a well-trained European engineer and has a command of historic architecture. And he really just blew the governor and everybody away. John Parker was the governor at the time. In terms of the Olmsteds, we actually found a letter from Link where he wrote to the governor and said, well, don't sorry for the landscape architects here. I should, shield your ears for a minute. But he basically said, you really don't need those guys anyway. They just read a bunch of books, and I've read all the same books, and I can do all that. You don't need those guys. Just pay me. Right? Which unfortunately I think has happened at least once or twice since then. And it's a big mistake, I think. The original campus was designed for 3,000 students. Link was asked to cut it in half. It was way too expensive, so it was designed for 1,500 students. And you'll see what he did was he makes reference to the original plan in that he, we'll go back here. If it'll let me go back. Yeah, and then what he does basically is he keeps the main axis, the idea, the orientation, levels it out with the compass a little bit, uses the fine arts quad from the Olmsteds, and takes the engineering quad and moves it over and attaches it here. Fine arts quad, and attaches it here. So that the diagram here is essentially derived from this one, but it loses its sort of magical connection to the landscape. And it becomes, unfortunately, and I'm an architect, it becomes unfortunately about, me, look at me, I'm the builder. Right? That being said, he did a pretty good job. The library, eventually the Olmsteds added a library, and so the library was always a part of this composition. The Indian mounds are there, but you kind of never know. That axis is simpler. Okay, so this quad then that he designed the entire thing of and did working drawings for a good bit of it, worked in Baton Rouge for a couple of years, maybe something like that, I think, and then died, unfortunately. His son, who had worked with him, tried to carry on, but the political pressure from the New Orleans firms was too great, and so eventually others were hired, and his son packed up and left. The plan that then develops is really a marvelous kind of plan in that it represents an organizational system that's been central to Western culture, has probably Roman roots, I would say, hierarchical, bilaterally symmetrical, a way of organizing really great complexity of information in a simple way to understand. A Fonville Wyman picture of LSU in the snow in the 40s to give you a good sense of this, what the organization looked like in the beginning. It wasn't all built up at once. Maybe 40% of it was built when the school opened and slowly filled in over the years. Himes, maybe was one of the last, and actually the boards here. In this photo, it's not even there yet. Based on the parade ground, which Link continues as a broad circle. So it starts off in a big circle on the ground, which is one of the oldest things that we've done as a people, with a vertical emphasis, a reference to the sky. The Soldiers and Sailors Memorial Tower, this was done just after World War I, which was very prominently in the minds and imagination of many Americans at the time. It was conceived as a memorial to Louisiana's war dead. There were a lot of these being done around the country at the time. It's organized as an axis, working effectively as a military sally port. It was meant to be open, and it was open for the first couple of decades, 2 or 3 decades. Later closed in, and has, if you haven't been in, it has plaques and beautiful ornamentation on the inside as a tribute to Louisiana's soldiers and sailors that lost their lives in the First World War. The composition is hierarchical, bilaterally symmetrical. It's based on the architecture of Northern Italy, the Italian Renaissance. The best understanding we have of that comes from the artist who was responsible for the, stucco surface, the pebbly stucco surface everywhere. His name was J.J. Early. He was working out of Washington, D.C. He's done some really interesting work around Washington, D.C., the old zoo and a number of structures there. It was in the 1920s, it was an innovative use of concrete. Concrete had not become a common building material for architects at the time. It had been used by engineers for a while. And he wanted to find a way to use it economically and to recreate ornamental detail reminiscent of the Italian Renaissance economically. And so in that sense, this campus is part of a bigger story. But early suggests in some of the material published in the American Concrete Association Journal that Link liked the idea of the Spanish influence here and using Southern European architecture is what Early says. And so dusty walls and terracotta tile roofs. And the Italian version of that, which is similar perhaps in some ways to the Spanish, the Italian traditions gave him more to work with as an architect, so that's the direction he went. As far as I know, it's the only northern Italian campus of its type in the country. I haven't come across another one yet. It's very unique in that regard, and then it has these formal devices. So that's what we're looking at here. It's based pretty explicitly on the architecture of Andrea Palladio, the great Italian master from the late 1500s. So in the Villa Bador here, for example, you get the idea of an entry axis. One of the things Palladio did was he not only designed the entire building inside and out, but he started to coordinate all the buildings on an estate with the main design idea so that everything on the estate was designed. So here you get all of the related farm buildings in a hierarchical composition where everything has a place. He really introduces that back into Western architecture in the late 1500s. Now, in terms of the World War I mentioned there are a number of these things being done. Perhaps the most famous is the National World War I Memorial in Kansas City. It sits on a hill above Union Station there. It was done pretty much at the same time of ours. It's similar in some ways, hierarchical, bilateral symmetry and that sort of thing, but it used an Egyptian reference. And of course, the idea of the Egyptian reference is time. It's ancient, it's going to stay. It's a value system. The long entry axis and the hill, and then the use of ornament. The closer you get to the center of a composition like this, the more elaborate it becomes, the more ornamented it becomes as a symbol of value. And you see that kind of thing in Kansas City. In recent years, they've added a museum under, which is pretty nicely done. As some of you here will remember when they were talking about putting the LSU museum under this 25 years ago. I'm glad they didn't do that. Another reference would be Rice University, which was done a little bit before, kind of a Byzantine style, very innovative kind of style, but it also uses a sally port, a military reference. And that's a reference to the military history of these two institutions, kind of gateway. It's a different kind of precedent. Here's the central room with all the plaques and the gates, which were moved when it was enclosed, are still there. They were moved, they were back on the inside of the wall. It's a very thick wall. So when you open the gates, they would be within the door frame. They moved them to the outside so they could put in the more modern gates. Actually, I was giving this talk a few years ago, and an elderly gentleman came up after the talk and said he was at LSU in 1947 when they did that, when they closed it. It's the only record that I've ever been able to find of it. So you have this idea of the great circle and the reference to the sky as symbolic of the service and sacrifice it takes to maintain a university in a public university. The obligation of the state. It's a beautiful theme, I think. Right there as we start. I'm always struck by the anachronistic character of the old automobiles, the 1920s automobiles in these original pictures. And that compositional system, if we put this in its place, is very sympathetic with the military and military organization. Bilateral symmetry, detail in the center. It's the same kind of manner of organizing that you would see in other aspects of society. So the military history of LSU is an important part of it. But as we start to move in, of course, all of you understand now that it was this entry axis, let's call it, that's dedicated to the interests of the people of the state and is an inviting axis, culminates in Hill Memorial Library, which in this photo you see back here. And this is the only photo I've been able to find ever where it's open still. You can still see through before it's closed off. The modules here that are along the side of the administration buildings are this pebbles, all colored pebbles, set into concrete. So a little bit of labor, but pretty inexpensive otherwise, representing, we think, and these are interpretations, the different things that go on at the university, part of the public trust. As you enter, you climb up a few steps to the podium, respecting the select system of meaning, and then you would see beyond the library. At the time, there was no state library, there was no state archives. This was thought of as the repository of knowledge for the people of Louisiana. A distinctive building. You see in the building itself, the great reading room, indicated by the high windows on the second floor. The Italians would call it the piano nobile, the first floor, the noble floor. When I was here in architectural school in the 1970s, we had design studios up there. I think it's better used today than that. And this little architectural motif here, the three pieces, the center one taller with the arch on it, comes to us from Rome. It was codified in the Italian Renaissance by Andrea Palladio, and in architectural history circles it's known as the Palladian motif today. It's a symbol that you're in this tradition, but also it's a symbol of hierarchy. If you're going to establish bilateral symmetry and a notion of hierarchy, you need a minimum of three pieces, and the middle one is privilege. And as you would go in this building at the time, you'd go up these marble stairs, and the reading room, not the reading room, there was an archival room that had the most valuable things in the collection that sat right here on the other side. And you'd go through this wooden arcade here that is just similar to this. And you climb the stairs, you turn around, walk back through this to find all of the treasures, and in the window in front of you, you see the Memorial Tower. So that the architectural scale of the campus and the level of detail and experience is reiterated and reiterated and reiterated. Right? 5 minutes? Until what? Until what? Oh, we got a long way to go. And you see here the Temple of Hadrian at Ephesus is just one example of that tradition. The library is based on the model of the Boston Public Library, which was barely 20 years old at the time. That is based on the Bibliothèque Sainte-Geneviève in Paris, mid-19th century, which is based on Leon Battista Alberti's Basilica of San Francesco, a renovation from the late 1500s, mid-1500s, a series of ideas that have influenced their way down. The Alberti building is one of the most influential in our history, a clear tracing back. So what we've got here is an entry axis that culminates at the repository of knowledge for the state, makes reference to the sky, and invites you in. Collection, preservation. And an axis, Van Cox, some of you know, a landscape architect, a good friend, did a rendering of what the quadrangle would look like now if Middleton wasn't there. So that internal axis then is crossed as you get inside that entry axis is crossed as you get inside by this other internal axis with Foster Hall at its head. Foster was originally the Student Union cafeteria building for the campus. It's designed, this beautiful simplified Roman temple kind of front, designed to be seen from 1,000 feet away. We saw it as a kind of a amalgam, if you will, of Roman traditions, so that Foster sits here. Peabody, the education college, was one of the few buildings, one of the major few buildings, other than the four at the end of the axis, that was actually drawn by Link. And he writes on the working drawings, he identifies the walkway as the cloister, making reference to religious tradition. And the religious tradition of the cloister comes from the Roman Forum. This is a drawing of the original St. Peter's in Rome that was torn down when the present building was there, after having been there for 1,000 years almost, or a little more. And it starts off with the Forum and then the Basilica in the background. The Romans, the Roman Christians, when Christianity was legalized, they avoided the buildings of the Roman religion as being tainted with pagan associations, and those temple buildings disappeared from Western architecture for 1,000 years. And they took the Roman code of law, turned it sideways, and used that as the basis for the Christian church. It was an inexpensive building to build, and it accommodated a large group. And one of the differences between Christianity and the Roman religion, and indeed all of the ancient religions in the Mediterranean, is that in the Christian religion, the ritual was practiced with the congregation present, so you needed a big room. In the Roman and Greek religions, you went by yourself to the temple and said your prayers and lit candles. And so that big room and this notion of the quadrangle, or this notion of the quad, or the forum. Here's another example. This is the forum in Leptis Magna, a Roman town in northern Africa, where the basilica is here. Basilica meaning the Roman court of law is here. You'd come through it into the forum, and then you would see the temple front. And so what we get here in a sense is a kind of a collapsing of all these together. Right? So you have the quadrangle, the cloister, the temple front, and then behind it, the dining hall. It's a big basilica-shaped building. 2 stories, beautiful room, was only used for a few years before the field house was built and became the cafeteria, and this got filled in, and the art studios are upstairs. The idea of student life as one pole of the campus internal axis. And then as we move along, the science, agricultural quad, the science group on the other side, this being the western side, a series of architectural forms that in a variety of ways represent this same kind of ordering system. These drawings were based on Theodore Link's drawings of these. You see how it's a 3-part composition, the center part of which is featured and is itself a 3-part composition. And then each of the pieces is a 3-part composition, set into another 3-part composition, and then with connecting pieces, so that you get a geometric, rhythmic, melodic kind of compositional. And you can carry this further as you go through the old campus and look at where detail is and what ties the whole thing together. And then 1 or 2 different buildings that are reused as you move around the campus. So, you know, you don't see a lot of these today because of the beautiful live oak trees, but nonetheless, there's value there. It's modeled after University of Virginia in some ways, clearly, in a loose kind of sense. And UVA was meant as a teaching campus, and so same thing Link wanted to happen here. So you get these 4, we've looked at 3 of them, kind of culminating axes that represent clusters of meaning that are brought together, expressed in different ways, all within the system, but with great variety in the system. And finally, Atkinson Hall, the main engineering building, the culmination of this engineering, science and engineering quad, here meant to be seen from 1,000 feet away as you come out of the arch at Foster after you've had your dinner every night. And you look down the main quad. It's a building that also is based on the architecture of Andrea Palladio pretty clearly in terms of compositional systems, hierarchy, bilateral symmetry, use of 3 over and over and over at different scales. It's the only building on the quad that has the rhythm of classrooms facing that space. I don't know, maybe that's a reference to the desks, the rigor of studies, or maybe to the military traditions. But it certainly speaks to academic and personal discipline as a corollary to student life and the common aspects of the campus. And then as you would go to visit your faculty advisors in their offices on the second floor of Atkinson Hall, you see this kind of thing after the Oaks went in. But just to recount this one sort of axis, it seems to refer to the role of the university in the state, service and knowledge, an internal axis between academic rigor and student life, fine and liberal arts quad and engineering quad, science and engineering, and then finally the shops here where the fruits of knowledge are put into production and given back to the people of the state. And that's almost a direct quote from Paul. Sacrifice, knowledge, community, and discipline. That's what we can do if we try.